The Islamic Republic of Iran is being attacked from three directions at once. From the outside, an American blockade that is strangling its economy down to the bone. From the water, a frozen strait that has cut off its oil exports and its lifeline to the world. And from within, a population that rose up against its own government and was met with a crackdown so brutal that international observers compared it to some of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. And now, Russia has stepped in, not with troops, not with missiles, but with something that could be just as dangerous: intelligence, diplomatic cover, and a direct line from the Kremlin to Tehran. Three threats, one regime, and a world that is now being forced to choose sides. This is the full picture, and it is far more dangerous than most headlines are telling you. Context set up. To understand what is happening today, you need to see all three layers of this crisis simultaneously. Because they are not separate stories, they are one story. Threat 1: internal. On December 28th, 2025, protests erupted across Iran, triggered by a collapsing currency, record inflation, and decades of accumulated rage. Within days, they spread to more than 200 cities. They became, by any measure, the largest uprising the Islamic Republic had faced since the revolution itself in 1979. The government's response was not restraint. It was a massacre. Security forces opened live fire on crowds. Between 30,000 and 36,000 protesters were reportedly killed in a matter of days, according to local health officials, making it the deadliest crackdown in modern Iranian history. The internet was shut down to hide it. Threat 2: external. Since February 28th, the US and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran, killing the supreme leader, destroying military infrastructure, and triggering a war that has now entered its third month. The US has imposed a naval blockade of Iranian ports. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz in retaliation. The result is a dual chokehold, both nations squeezing each other's economic jugular, while the global economy bleeds from the pressure of both. Threat 3: the wild card, Russia. This week, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi flew to St. Petersburg. He met Vladimir Putin face to face, and what came out of that meeting is reshaping the entire strategic picture of this war. So, a regime under siege from its own people, blockaded by the world's most powerful military, and now drawing closer to a nuclear-armed authoritarian power that has every reason to want the United States to fail. That is tonight's story, and it starts from the inside out. Escalation. Let's start with what is happening inside Iran right now, Iwa, because this is the part of the story that the regime most desperately does not want the world to focus on. The protests of early 2026 were suppressed. The internet was cut. The crackdown was so severe that by February, Iran's own president, Masoud Pezeshkian, stood before his nation and apologized. He apologized for the massacres. That is a remarkable and largely unreported moment. The sitting president of the Islamic Republic acknowledging that what his government did to its own people was wrong. And yet, the regime survived. Security forces remained loyal. No significant defections occurred, and the uprising was crushed. But here is what analysts warn the international community is underestimating. The internal pressure has not gone away. It has gone underground. The same economic conditions that sparked those protests, currency collapse, food inflation over 100%, energy shortages, mass unemployment, have not improved. They have gotten dramatically worse. The US blockade has now cut off Iran's oil exports, which are the regime's primary source of hard currency. Bread prices are up 140%, meat up 135%. The central bank has issued the largest denomination banknote in Iranian history just to keep pace with inflation. Sources suggest that ordinary Iranians are making impossible choices between food and fuel, daily. This is the explosive internal threat, not a single dramatic event, but a slow, grinding economic collapse happening to 90 million people in a country where the government has already shown it will shoot protesters to stay in power, and where the next wave of unrest may be larger, angrier, and harder to suppress than anything that came before. Experts warn if the blockade holds for another 2 to 3 months, The internal situation inside Iran could reach a breaking point that no security force can contain. Key developments. 4 hard developments. Development 1. Russia is not just cheering from the sidelines, it is actively tipping the scales. Multiple U.S. intelligence sources, first reported by CNN and subsequently confirmed through additional reporting, say that Russia has been providing Iran with real-time intelligence on American military positions. Satellite imagery, movement data on U.S. warships, aircraft, and troop locations, passed directly from Russian assets to Iranian commanders. Sources say this intelligence helped Iran conduct more precise retaliatory strikes, and that several Iranian drones hit locations where U.S. troops had been recently positioned. And this week, on April 27th, Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi sat across from Putin in St. Petersburg and described Moscow's support as firm and unshaken. Putin told him directly, Russia will do what it can to support the interests of Iran. Russia's defense minister simultaneously met Iran's deputy defense minister and pledged that Moscow was ready to do everything possible to help resolve the situation. At the United Nations Security Council, Russia's ambassador went further, saying Iran has every right to close the Strait of Hormuz during wartime, comparing Western countries calling for freedom of navigation to, in his words, pirates. Russia and China have already vetoed a Security Council resolution that would have secured free passage through the strait. That veto, quiet, procedural, easy to miss in the daily flood of headlines, may prove to be one of the most consequential acts of this entire conflict. But that's not all. Development 2. Russia is also offering to be Iran's nuclear escape valve. And that offer is deeply alarming to Washington. Russia has formally proposed to take custody of Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium, storing or reprocessing it on Russian soil. On the surface, this sounds like a de-escalatory gesture. But analysts say it is anything but. If Iran transfers its enriched uranium to Russia, it removes the primary leverage point that the United States and Israel cited for launching this war in the first place. Tehran could preserve its nuclear program's intellectual infrastructure and technical capacity while technically complying with demands to disarm, then retrieve or reconstitute it later under Russian protection. Iran, for its part, has reportedly said it will not give up its stockpile. But the offer is on the table, and sources suggest it is creating significant tension inside the U.S.-Israel strategic partnership over how to respond to a scenario where Russia becomes the custodian of Iranian nuclear material. What happened next shocked analysts. Development 3. The blockade is hardening, not softening, even as it triggers a global economic crisis. U.S. Central Command confirmed this week that American forces have turned back 38 ships attempting to enter or leave Iranian ports since the blockade began on April 13th. U.S. Navy destroyers have entered the Strait of Hormuz for the first time since the war began, conducting what CENTCOM described as mine clearance operations. Iran's IRGC called it a ceasefire violation and threatened a severe response. And Trump, whose language on Iran has been consistently escalatory, described the blockade this week in terms that leave little room for ambiguity. He said Iran's oil pipelines could, in his view, explode within days from the pressure of blocked exports. Experts told CNN that claim is overstated. But the intent behind it is clear. Washington wants Tehran to feel that time is running out. The blockade, Trump told reporters, is somewhat more effective than the bombing. They are choking. 3 aircraft carrier groups are now in the region. The USS Abraham Lincoln, the USS Gerald R. Ford, the USS George H.W. Bush. Together, 15,000 sailors and Marines, over 200 aircraft, plus an amphibious assault group. That is the largest concentration of American naval firepower in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. This is where things take a dangerous turn. Development 4, Pakistan, the only mediator both sides trusted, has gone quiet. And that silence is deafening. Since the ceasefire was brokered on April 8th, Pakistan had been the essential thread holding the diplomatic process together. Its army chief personally negotiated the truce. It hosted talks in Islamabad. It served as the physical meeting point between U.S. and Iranian negotiators. But this weekend, Pakistan took down all the checkpoints and security it had deployed in anticipation of a new round of negotiations. The infrastructure of diplomacy has been dismantled. Sources say there is no immediate hope of talks resuming. Trump canceled his envoy's planned trip to Islamabad. He told Iran to simply call Washington if they wanted to talk. When the mediator starts packing up its security apparatus, it is not a good sign. It is, in fact, the diplomatic equivalent of someone quietly backing toward the exit before the situation gets worse. High stakes. Let me put all of this into its full global frame because the stakes here extend far beyond one regime, one strait, or one war. Russia providing satellite intelligence to Iran is not a bilateral Iran-Russia issue. It is a direct challenge to U.S. military superiority and a test of whether Washington will respond to what amounts to indirect Russian aggression against American troops in the field. Defense Secretary Hegseth told reporters this week that Russia and China are not really a factor in the Iran war, but U.S. officials simultaneously accuse Moscow of indirect aggression. Both of those things cannot be equally true. The internal situation in Iran carries its own global weight. A regime collapse in Tehran would not be a clean, liberating transition. Analysts assess it would unleash a prolonged period of instability. In a country of 90 million people, sitting on the world's fourth largest proven oil reserves, bordering Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Turkey, and the Caspian states. The chaos of an Iranian implosion would make the aftermath of the 2003 Iraq invasion look contained by comparison. And yet, the regime's continued survival, achieved through mass killings and economic suffocation, creates its own long-term instability. Meanwhile, the 36 nations that have signed statements calling for the reopening of the strait are not doing so out of abstract principle. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and India get 70 to 80% of their oil through that waterway. Every week the strait stays closed, their reserves diminish, their prices rise, and their governments face domestic political pressure that is increasingly difficult to manage. This is not a Middle East story. This is a story about the stability of the entire international order. And right now, that order is under pressure from every direction at once. Twist, uncertainty. Now, here's what does not quite add up. And I think it is important to say this clearly. The official narratives from every single actor in this conflict are, at minimum, incomplete. Russia says it wants peace. Putin told Iran's foreign minister in St. Petersburg that Russia will do what it can to support peace in the region. But simultaneously, Russian intelligence is reportedly being used to help Iran strike American troops. Those two things are not reconcilable. You cannot be the peacemaker and the weapons supplier at the same time. Unless the goal is not peace, but prolonged, managed conflict in which Russia remains indispensable to both sides. The United States says the blockade is working. Trump says Iran is choking. But the same blockade that is squeezing Iran is pushing Russia to offer it an economic lifeline, a north-south corridor through the Caspian, bypassing every Western-controlled sea lane. The harder the U.S. squeezes, the deeper the Russia-Iran axis becomes. Sources suggest that if this goes on much longer, Iran's economic dependence on Russia could reach a point where even a future deal with the U.S. cannot fully reverse it. The blockade may be winning the battle while losing the strategic war. And inside Iran, the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, has barely been seen in public since his father was killed. His statements are read aloud by others on state television. He has not appeared at a single public rally or official ceremony. Nobody outside the inner circle knows with certainty who is actually making decisions inside the Islamic Republic right now. Is the foreign minister negotiating with genuine authority? Is the military running its own parallel strategy? Is there a power struggle unfolding behind closed doors that could either break the regime's negotiating position or harden it into something far more dangerous? We don't know. And in a nuclear-adjacent conflict involving four major powers, uncertainty at the top of the most opaque regime on Earth is not a minor footnote. It is the most important variable in this entire story. Conclusion. Here's where the world stands tonight. A regime that massacred tens of thousands of its own citizens to survive is now being squeezed to the edge of economic collapse by an American blockade it cannot break and a strait it cannot permanently close. Its new supreme leader is invisible. Its foreign minister is flying between Islamabad, Muscat, and St. Petersburg looking for anyone who can offer leverage. Its people are hungry, angry, and living under internet blackouts that keep the world from seeing what is really happening on the ground. Russia has stepped in, not as a military ally, but as something potentially more durable: an intelligence partner, a diplomatic shield, a nuclear custodian, and an economic lifeline that bypasses every Western sanction ever written. Putin is not saving Iran out of friendship. He is investing in Iran's survival because a prolonged American entanglement in the Middle East serves Russian interests in Ukraine, in the Arctic, in every theater where Moscow and Washington are in competition. Three aircraft carrier groups sit in the Gulf. A hypersonic missile that has never been fired in combat waits for an order. The Strait of Hormuz carries drifting mines that nobody can locate. Pakistan's diplomats have gone home. And inside the Islamic Republic, somewhere behind internet blackouts and state television, 90 million people are waiting to see which breaks first: the regime's grip or the world's patience. In 1979, a revolution changed Iran and sent shockwaves that the world is still living with nearly 50 years later. What is happening now is, in scope and consequence, at least as significant. And unlike 1979, this time the entire world has a stake in the outcome. At the pump, at the port, and in the corridors of every major government on Earth. The regime is under threat from within. The blockade is hardening from without. And Russia has picked a side. And the world is watching what happens next. Iran crumbles from inside. Russia picks aside three threats. One regime, no exit. The regime nobody can see. Who is actually running Iran right now? Russia gave Iran America's military secrets, and nobody's talking about it. 90 million people, a collapsing economy, and an invisible supreme leader. Iran's real crisis.